Welcome to Scandinavian Freedom. This is Björn Herstad, and today we are going to discuss Brazil and the present political development there. And my guest today is Levi Borba from something called USP Livre, a conservative and anti-socialist alternative media project that has been existing for 8 years, I think. Welcome, Levi.
Welcome, Björn. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
I'm very glad to have you here.
Thank you. I'm also glad to participate and together with the Swedish people that are listening to us today.
So you have a quite big followership, as I understand it, 164,000, something like this?
Yeah, currently we have on our Facebook, which are our main channel, 165,000 people following us. 2 years ago, we are quite small. Still, we had only 20 to 25,000. In the last elections, our base grew a lot. Recently, we also started our YouTube channel, which is very recent, but it's already around 8,000 people. We expect to grow to and go to another media and hopefully be able to dodge any attempt of those media to censor us.
All right. But you have been able to send on Facebook and YouTube for the moment? You have not been closed down?
No. For the moment, we are going quite fine. Of course, we always receive some strikes from Facebook. We already left Twitter because it was so complicated and so much harassment of the administration from Twitter that we just left it. So now we're just on Facebook and we started on YouTube. And for the moment, we don't have any major problem.
All right. Sounds good. I thought we would go directly to the topic about Brazil and Bolsonaro. But would it be possible for us to start a little bit earlier to give some kind of political background for our listeners to just get a brief understanding about Brazil and where you have come today?
Sure. To understand the effect, how Bolsonaro came to power, we need just to go a bit back, even before I was born, during the times of the military regime. We even don't call it military dictatorship because it was not a de facto dictatorship, even because they started by popular acclamation. When the anniversary of the dictatorship of the regime, actually, it's celebrated this week, by the way. And Bolsonaro already instituted official celebrations of it when it started in Brazil.
And yes, so everybody, the military regime took power in 1964.
Yeah, it was on the 31 of March that it took power, between 31 of March to 2 of April. In those 3 days, it took power. And actually, it was not a coup itself, but it was the biggest street protest in the story of the country, called March for the Families, where hundreds of thousands of people actually asked for the deposition of the government that was there, the socialist government, and using the institutional tools, the military took power. But it was by popular acclamation, not by a coup. Until recently, it was still the biggest public demonstration of the history of the country, the one that was asking for the military to take power. So it was not a coup itself.
All right. And what may I ask, what was the triggering political situation? Why did they gather to protest and demand that the military stepped in?
During the 60s, not only in Brazil, but in other countries in South America, the usual socialist tools of printing money and trying to give free things, they started to generate economical problems. And besides that, it was a growing fear of Soviet influence, because in many countries, including Chile, for example, and Brazil, there was already hundreds and in some cases thousands of Cubans trained in military age that were using their apparatus to train militia and other kind of secret groups all Soviet sponsored. And the growing fear of the population of the real installation of a communist regime triggered that. Of course, there was also a bit of element of American propaganda, because it was convenient for USA too to say, hey, all those Cubans that are trained by Soviet Union, they may install a communistic regime, which was not a lie. Actually, it was true. They wanted to install a communistic regime. Even it was disclosed recently in WikiLeaks, some documents from the Soviet Union exchanged with Cuba that talked about general revolution in Brazil during this time.
And and then this military regime, they hold power for 20 years or something like that?
Yeah, they hold power for 24 years, to be more exactly. And during this time, the economical conditions were actually very good until the 70s, when there was the oil shock. It was really good. Brazil was growing between 7 to 13% per year, and became from a very agrarian, very backwards country to the 60th biggest economy of the world. So when Brazil left, when Brazil went until the 70s, when had one of the biggest crises in the world, the oil shock, it was one of the greatest economies in the world. The pictures of those times really show how totally different nation was then. People very well dressed, much more on a European style than Latin American style itself, and walking freely in the streets, safely, enjoying life, and without bigger problems of delinquency and all the things that we know today. So Brazil was growing between 7 to 13% per year during the military regime. And one of the biggest allegations that the people that criticize the regime, they say it's about the repression. But the repression, actually, in Brazil, it was quite symbolic. The whole amount of people killed during the military regime was 357. And this is a number that was not made by the military, but by the families of the leftist militias that were killed, actually. So it was a number coming from the victims that show 357 people murdered by the military regime. And most of those people, they were actually involved in Marxist guerrillas. They had passports stamped on travels to Cuba, for example, or Russia, and a few other places that, Soviet Union, and few other places that were sponsoring Marxist guerrillas. So it was very symbolic, the amount of people killed during this regime.
And could you say something about the political orientation of this regime?
Yes. It was the strongest thing is that it was a non-aligned regime, because at the same time that it was, of course, anti-communist, in its essence, it was anti-communist. It also had a big partnership with countries like China, Yugoslavia, and USA. So it was anti-communist, but anti-Soviet in its essence. For the fear of the Cuban influence in Brazil, all those Cuban agents. So it was anti-Soviet, but at the same time, it had a big partnerships with China and Yugoslavia, which were communistic countries. Even at this time, China became one of the biggest trading partners of Brazil. Besides that, it was a creation of what they call it national giants, which were huge state companies that the main goal was to create military technology, high-tech technology, all kinds of development in the industrial park. And that was probably the biggest merit of the military regime. They turned an agrarian country into an industrial regional power. From the military regime, Brazil came as the third biggest airplane manufacturer in the whole world, and one of the top 5 biggest manufacturers of weapons, among many other things. And before then, it was just planting soybean, corn, and cocoa. So,
and the
military orientation and anti-Soviet, but not strictly anti-communist. I would say anti-Soviet.
And these companies, they were state-owned, you said?
Nowadays, some of them are still state-owned. Some of them are not. For example, this airplane manufacturer called Embraer, which is today the third biggest manufacturer of the world, she is partially owned by the government, partially owned by private enterprises, but is still under the hand of the government somehow. Other companies, they were privatized during the last years. And this is also another interesting thing, that when the military regime finished, those that took power were actually involved. Those that took power by democratic ways, they were actually those that were involved with those communist guerrillas. And one of the first presidents, one of the most famous politicians of Brazil, actually, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, his right hand, which was Aloysio Nunes, he was the driver of the most villainous, the most ominous Marxist guerrilla fighter in Brazil, which was Carlos Lacerda, famous for his ruthless way of killing people. So those that took power when the democratization happened, which were the social democrats in Brazil, they turned those state giants into pits of corruption. They started basically to drain the money from those state giants to the point that they start to make them lose money. And just after that, they privatize it because they say, well, all those companies, they are losing money, so we need to privatize them now. And they privatized most of them.
How come the democratization process started?
When happened the oil shock in 1974, which was a global crisis, which just had a parallel with 2008, with the crisis of 2008. Also, 1974 had this huge crisis made by the oil shock. And Brazil, being a country that at this time it was still heavily dependent of oil and low oil prices, inflation skyrocketed. And after that, Brazil had one of the biggest inflations in the whole world. We are talking about 4,000 or 5,000% of inflation. And unfortunately, the military regime didn't know how to handle this inflation, which was also not only in Brazil, but in all the neighbors, which were also troubled by the oil prices. And that started to create a lot of popular insatisfaction. And together with that, we had the slow opening of the media to private investors. And the media also started to do campaigns to start the redemocratization. And the military regime peacefully handled the power. And in 1988, Brazil created a new constitution. And on the following year, there was elections. And of course, with the heavy support of the media, the Social Democrats just came to power.
And what were their core positions on that time that made them gain the popular vote?
At that time, they had a kind of program that was basically to defeat inflation. As I said, Brazil was having hundreds, sometimes 4,000% per year of inflation. And that was just driving the whole population crazy. The money was worth nothing at this point. And the Social Democrats in 1994, they created a new currency and they increased they took a lot of loans in the foreigner markets and they done some economical adjustments. All that together, they managed to cut the inflation out and to finish the inflation. And with that, their popularity just went to levels above 80%. Because after decades under hyperinflation, the population just found it wonderful. The stories that we hear from the time of hyperinflation, they are just horrendous. And then they became very, very popular, and they governed the country during 12 years. So during 8 years, actually, from 1994 to 2002, the Social Democrats governed. And the biggest problem is that the Social Democrats themselves, they were quite of a one horse track. They only cared about the economy, and the whole cultural structure of the country, they just handled it to the far left. And I'm talking about, when I talk far left, I'm talking about the worst kind of neo-marxist that you can imagine, which is a whole intelligentsia that came from universities. And that is the funny thing. During the military regime, they created a lot of universities to educate the population, and they sent the most bright minds of the country to France, to study in France. During a time, during the 70s, when the academia in France was populated by Marxists. So the military regime, they made the stupidity to plan their own death. They created a lot of universities to educate the population, and they think it's a good idea to send all the brightest minds to study in France, and they brought from France all the ideas of people like Foucault, Lacan, Arnaud, and all those neo-Marxists that we know. And they, from the redemocratization onwards, they just started to dominate the whole intellectual environment of Brazil. Then they went to the media, and when people start to realize they just had total hegemony of power, which was their target from the beginning.
And what happened later then in the 90s? You said the Social Democrats lost power?
Yeah, because they came to power because they defeated inflation. At the same time that they were putting the economy on the economy on a good road, they were adjusting all the problems that Brazil had, and everyone was happy consuming things. On the dark corner of the country, which we call the universities, all those French-influenced Marxists, they were starting to go to the journals, to the media. They were starting to slowly infiltrate. So to the point that if you read any newspaper of Brazil today and you see the same newspaper in the 90s, it's completely unrecognizable. While in the 90s, they were even talking about a crime committed by indigenous person that assaulted a young girl from higher class. Today, they are just putting this person that provoked the criminal by showing his possessions. So it turned totally into this political correctness and all those things that we see in the whole world. So they were dominating the universities, and from the university they went to the media. And they infiltrated in the media and the universities during 15 years, more or less, to the point that some of the greatest thinkers and some of the greatest philosophers that we had in Brazil, conservative philosophers, they just either enter into ostracism or they just move it out from the country, which is nowadays is even interesting because the mind behind the government Bolsonaro, he actually doesn't live in Brazil. And the sole reason that he doesn't live in Brazil is that he was kicked out by all those infiltrated Marxists in the universities. So in 2002, in 2001, the journals started to make, they want to find a way to take the Social Democrats of power because there were only the useful idiots for the Marxists. The Marxists wanted to get rid of the military regime, but they knew that at this point there was still a fear of the word socialism. So they came with the Social Democrats, which were those useful idiots that would not threaten their domination of the universities and of the media, and at the same time they would fix the economy to deliver to the socialists a country with good economy and totally infiltrated by them. And then in 2001 and 2000, the Social Democratic government, the economy was still fine, but there was some minor scandals, things that it doesn't even come close to the billions and billions and billions that the current economic scandals. but it was like one social democrat politician employing his cousin, the other social democrat politician using the credit card of the government to buy a fancy dinner. But every single day, the media was bombing those small news to the point that they could mine the whole credibility of the social democrats, because they knew this is the moment that we want to come to power. 2002, we have elections. So we need to mine the social democrats. So we come to power and we establish the cherry of the cake of our hegemonical project that started 15 years ago. They made that very easily, since of the 6 TV channels, 6 major TV channels we have in Brazil, 5 of them were belonging in some way or another to this intelligentsia from the universities. And the only channel that doesn't belong to them is a channel that is related to some religious groups, Protestant groups. But all the other 5 were belonging to them. And they also, and this is the most incredible thing, during those 15 years, they also managed to infiltrate in the institution that during the military regime, and even before that, was one of the most influential in the whole country, which was the Catholic Church. And this is the most incredible thing, because when today we say that if it was not for the Protestants in Brazil, probably would still be under a socialist regime, it was because they infiltrated in the Catholic Church, not in Brazil, but in Argentina, in Chile, in many other countries, and they mined it from inside.
You mean these communist guerrillas or communist intellectuals? They infiltrated the Catholic Church.
They infiltrated in the church, and they created an aberration called liberation theology. That nowadays is even considered heresy by the Catholic Church, but at this time it was still not. It was Benedict XVI that considered it heresy. But they created this liberation theology that puts basically Jesus as somehow a pre-Marxist leader. And a lot of people start to buy that, to the point that even bishops in Brazil, they have very heavy socialist ideas, to the point that we have in Brazil masses in pro of LGBT nowadays, something that is not unimaginable in any other country outside South America. So they infiltrated every single institution, church, media, universities. In 2002, they came to power with a great economy, a relatively stable country. And one of the first tools that they started to do, it was the relaxation of the laws, of the criminal laws. During the military regime, we didn't have death penalty, but the maximum term in prison for a murder, for example, it was 30 years. Nowadays, a murder in Brazil, stay in jail for 3 or 4 years. So it's almost the same as a petty robber in Europe. They started the relaxation of the criminal laws. They started partnerships with Marxist guerrillas in other countries around Brazil, and the most significant of them is the Forças Armadas Revolucionárias de Colombia, the FARC, which is also a big group of drug lords. So they could finance between them, and they created a huge group called Foro de São Paulo. The Foro de São Paulo, although it had its inceptions earlier in the 90s, it came to full power in the beginning of this new century. Because in the beginning of this new century, they had the whole structure of drug exportation to finance them. So every single person in Europe that decides to sniff cocaine, that decided to smoke something, they were actually financing Marxist groups in South America, because the Foro de São Paulo united the university intelligentsia, the Marxists from the universities, together with the drug lords for a common goal. which was the creation of liberal leftist narco-states. They were just tolerating each other, of course, but they were allied in the same project. So the Foro de São Paulo was the union between government and narco lords from Bolivia, Colombia, Panama, Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina. And in the beginning of the new century, every single country in South America, except two, and one of them was Colombia, were under government of politicians from the Foro de São Paulo.
And can you elaborate a little bit more about that? I mean, from a European perspective, so we understand why are the drug lords allied with the left, and why are the left-wing guerrillas and communist guerrillas involved in drug trafficking?
The main idea was they were those drug lords. They were already suppressed during the military regimes, because South America somehow behaved almost like a bloc. All of them together were military regimes, and all of them together went to the democratic regime at the same time, more or less. So when they went to the democratic regime, the drug lords saw the opportunity that, well, let's finance some faction that will not repress us, and in exchange, we finance their governments and their campaigns. But there is also intellectual background on that. Remember when I said that those leftists, they just had a very heavy French influence. And this French influence comes mainly from Foucault and from Lacan. And Foucault and Lacan, those two French neo-marxists, they always put that one of the first ways to destroy the social fabric of a society, to go for a next step, which is a socialist regime, is to implement behaviors that are also revolutionary. And among the behaviors is the usage of drugs. Not only the usage of drugs, but also homosexuality, religious innovation, and all those things. Irregiosity, and all those things. So the intellectual background of those neo-Marxists that they studied in France and they went to Brazil to the universities, also were in favor of the drug commerce.
So they view the drug use as such, as a revolutionary tool.
Exactly that. They view the drug usage as a revolutionary tool. They view the liberation of criminals as a revolutionary tool, because they were seeing the criminals not as criminals, but as victims of society, victims of a traditional society that oppressed them. And they saw also those people that were selling drugs as people that were disenfranchised by society.
And from a Swedish perspective, when I think about Brazil, we think about these high crime rates, the favelas, and perhaps the carnivals and the nice sun. But you mean before the democratization, Brazil more or less looked like any other European country?
I would say, of course, there are differences in, for example, in music, but during the military regime, Brazil will not be very different of what was Portugal. We are talking about a country that had 10 murders per 100,000 people. That is pretty much an average of some European countries. Totally different than the 36 murders per 100,000 people that we have nowadays. And in addition to that, the culture was typically Latin culture, while today, all this thing of bossa nova and those things, they are pretty much dead. Since they started to import hip hop and all those Americanisms that, although they are American, they appease to the cultural Marxist intelligentsia.
Mm-hmm. And these left-wing influences, they took a grip of the country, and did they hold it up until now, or do we also have some complications in the political scene before this?
Yes, what happened is, remember when I say that the military regime, they created those huge companies, those huge state-owned companies with the sole purpose of industrialize Brazil. And they were very successful in that. They managed to industrialize Brazil. But once they left the companies, once they left the government, those companies, they were very easy prey for those neo-marxists to use them as a purpose to create their super structure, their hegemonic structure. Because another author that is very influent in the left in Brazil is Antonio Gramsci. He's almost saw as a god to them. And one of his ideas that every single tool that the government have should be used to create our hegemony, our leftist hegemony, our socialist hegemony. And when they went to power in 2002, they just took a grab of all those state-owned companies. And the jewel of the crown was the Brazilian oil company called Petrobras. During the 90s and the beginning of the new century, Petrobras was one of the 10 biggest companies of the world. It was, at this time, of a size similar to IBM and General Motors. And they managed to infiltrate so many people. We are talking about thousands, between 4,000 to 5,000 members of the Workers' Party in the oil company, also in energy companies, post office companies, airlines, regulatory agencies, environment companies. At this point, it was more than 30,000 members of the Workers' Party infiltrated in every single company. And the idea of the Workers' Party is, we'll put you in the companies, you give back some of your salary to us, and we'll use that to just reinforce the image of the Workers' Party as the father of the nation. And they start to use this money to simply trample every single kind of opposition, together with criminal groups, criminal gangs that were their allied, that they use it somehow also to take out opposition from the way. So it was normal that you see some politician that was killed apparently in a robbery, but we know that it was not a robbery. At this point, and when they started to cover all the companies, came the crisis of 2008. And in the crisis of 2008, until then, they were sucking all the money from those state-owned companies successfully. But in the crisis of 2008, due to the bad conditions of the world market, those companies also start to go down. Oil prices start to go down. And those companies, they started to lack money. So one judge from one judge and some other agents from the Brazilian Federal Police, they start to investigate that in an operation called Operation Car Wash. And it's called car wash because they were using a car wash to hide the money, all the money that they were stealing, which was money enough even to put at risk the structure of the building. How heavy it was that was putting at danger the structure of the building, the billions that they were taking. So this investigation started to get so big that it was already impossible for the government to hide it. And then some of those politicians started to go to jail. And at this point, people also start to go to the streets, because those companies, they were so big that their bankruptcy put down the whole economy of the country. So from a country that was, during the military regime, growing 13% per year, and then enter into a recession of 7%. It was the second worst recession of the world at this time, just not worse than the Syrian recession because they were at war. And then together with that, it came a crime that started to skyrocket. Because those neo-Marxists, those Foucaultians, neo-Marxists, those Parisian influenced, they always put the poor people as victims of society. And that any crime committed is not fault of the criminal, is not fault of the person that murders, that kills, that rapes, but actually fault of the society that failed them. And maybe they knew it, maybe they didn't, but this way of thinking that was propagated by the media and the schools. Imagine every single school in a favela, in a poor suburb, telling to kids, hey, you are victims of society. When you steal, it's not your fault. It's fault of this person that had this watch that you wanted to steal. And all schools telling that to poor kids, they started to be cradles of criminals. So then it came to a point that Brazil was having 64,000 murders per year. And that, even more than the economic crisis, was the reason of the fall of the socialist government. The economic crisis indeed had their role in destroying the government. But the explosion of violence and delinquency, that was the real role. Because what the government may expect is that these people, by hearing, hey, you are victims of society, they will only support the government. But no, this absolution, this absolvation of any guilt that poor people had to commit crimes, it started to create new criminals. And violence is skyrocketing in a way that people just start to close themselves in their home, to the point that even inside the favelas, people start to steal from each other and kill each other because they say, I am more victim than you, because you may be poor, but I am poor and black, or you may be poor, but I'm poor, black, and gay, and then it goes. The victimization starts to take a very violent phase, which brings violence. Some people just left Brazil at this point. I am one of them, especially after one of my relatives be murdered in front of his home. I just say, oh, I'm going to leave the country. A lot of people made the same. But the others that stayed there, they say, we don't want to live in a country that have more murders than Syria, which was what was happening. Syria was murdered 38,000 people in 2015. In Brazil was murdered 2016. In Brazil was murdered 62,000 people.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yes, and that's what put the country down. The total collapse of any sense of safety, of any sense of walking the street. People start to get neurotic. And not only the middle class or the upper class, but even lower classes that felt threatened by the growing delinquency, they just, so we must get out of this. And then came Bolsonaro, a very, very, at this point, a very lower congressman, because he was not some big figure. But he just started to say things that were unimaginable in Brazil at this point. Because imagine a country that teaches that if you get robbed or if you get raped, you may not even complain if this person is from a favela, because this is your fault. You know, it's the fault of your ancestors that probably bring him 200 years ago in a slave boat or something like that. And now you got raped or murdered, but you should not complain and take care of your words because you may offend him. And then came Bolsonaro and say, a good criminal is a dead criminal, or the dictatorship just didn't kill it enough, and that was their problem. Or together with that, there was also, parallel to all the stories, there was also the gay lobby that in Brazil was very strong. And it started to, at the beginning, they were just asking for civil rights. But after they conquered the civil rights, like marriage and all those things that are allowed in Brazil now, they start to ask for quotas in the best universities, quotas in public companies, special ways to finance their things. And nobody could criticize them for the risk of losing the job or losing your possessions. And then came Bolsonaro and say, I would rather have, if my son started to show effeminate behaviors, I would just beat him until he became a man. And people got to know him. And the media, they also shoot their own feet because they start to show and say, how horrible is this guy? We need to destroy him. But when the media start to show that to people, they're just saying, actually not. Because this guy is saying the things that we should be allowed to say. And even if some people didn't agree with him, they just had the taste for the first time in 16 years of social democrat and socialist government of what it may be liberty to tell something that really bothers them, which was the violence, which was the excessive demands of the gay lobby, and all those things.
And during all this time, if I understand it correctly, he entered the parliament in the beginning of the 90s?
Yes, he entered the parliament just after the redemocratization. At the beginning, because when the militaries, they left the regime, they were very afraid that they would suffer some retaliation from those communist guerrillas that they always fight against, and they now were coming to power. So the biggest flag of Bolsonaro to get elected in the 90s, much time ago, it was that he would help to protect the militaries against retaliation from those socialists that were now coming to power. And during years and years, he was also one stone keyboard, because he was always talking about the same thing. We need to take care of our military. We need to take care of our military. And with a bit of nationalist tone, but he never talked about other things. In the last 7 or 8 years that he adopted a tone to talk against other things, like when his first big show was when he called gay couples potential rapists, and he denounced a book that was being implemented in basic schools that were teaching about gay love and with pictures of two men together in a bed and all those things. And he denounced that, and he was also prosecuted by that. He almost lost his term for that. So that's the time that he really appeared for the people and in the media.
And I mean, the gay agenda is a very integrated part of the neo-marxist assault on the cultural structure of Brazil, you would say?
I would say that although at the beginning was not their biggest priority, because at the beginning they were infiltrating the Catholic Church, they were infiltrating universities, and the gays were put a bit aside. But at the 90s, they realized that this could be a perfect trap for the Brazilian society, because even during military regime, it was always very remarked, this idea of the Brazilian society has a relatively peaceful and tolerant and all those things society in terms of openness to international ideas. So even during military regime, they never put that aside. They say, okay, we have not a problem with this kind of thing, as long as you don't touch our gold in our floor, our oil, because the military regime, they were very nationalist for the resources of the country, but they're not very nationalist in terms of the cultural background of the country. They were actually very, very loose on that. And this is even a critics that a lot of people do against them. And then they realized in the 90s that those neo-Marxists, they found, okay, now we infiltrated the church, so what we should do now to completely destroy the church in a country where 90%, 85% of the people were Catholic? Well, we just put together the two most antagonistic things, and we start to bring gay lobby inside the church, inside the media, because that was just start to create something that a very famous Brazilian conservative philosopher named it, is what he call a cognitive parallax, a cognitive dissonance. People, they will start to see gay has happy people, quiet people, peaceful people, and at the same time they'll say, oh, but my priest was saying that this is not good. So if those people are so genuinely happy and lovely, then my priest is just wrong. And that's how they start to empty the church in Brazil. And they also use this whole gay idea to, at some point, start to destroy families, saying, if your parents doesn't accept you as you are, just call us and we'll find a way to save you from your parents. Things as horrible as that. Something that we see in Europe now, in Brazil was happening 15 years ago. At this point, we were a bit of pioneers in this kind of agenda. So they used the gay discourse to weaponize their attempts to ruin the social fabric, the fabric of society. And they were very successful in that. They were very successful.
Can I ask about the party Bolsonaro belongs to, the Social Liberal Party?
Yeah, this is one of the things that people in Europe, they always get surprised at. How is it possible that a conservative politician like Bolsonaro belongs to the Social Liberal Party? The basic thing is that the name of a party in Brazil doesn't mean anything, because all those parties, they were created 30 or 40 years ago, and some of them 15 or 20. And to create a party in Brazil is very difficult. So they basically change hands, and people, it's almost like they sell a party to each other. They just don't change the name. So many parties were created as a national party or something like that, and today they are heavily leftist. So the name of the party being Social Liberal Party doesn't mean that the party is social liberal. This party belonged to the beginning, it belonged to some people involved with military, and then it changed to a man that he bought the party, and he's basically the owner of a football team in Brazil. And he just wanted to make money of the party, and then he was putting young people that were very libertarian. They were actually even in favor of many of the Marxist agendas, like abortion, legalization of drugs, free immigration, and all those things. But they were very unsuccessful in the elections, those young people. And then the owner of this party say, okay, so if libertarians didn't manage to make my party succeed, I need to look for another way. And at this time, Bolsonaro didn't have a party. So he just invited Bolsonaro and said, if you make my party succeed, as long as I will also be able to be elected congressman in the party, you will have the party for you. So he basically transferred the party to Bolsonaro. He didn't change the name, because to change the name of a party is very difficult. But now this party is basically the party of Bolsonaro, his family, and the others. Because the whole idea of Bolsonaro started with him alone. During many years, he was a single fighter in the arena in Brazil, because it had social democrats and socialists fighting each other, and he was saying those horrendous things as a totally underdog politician. Together with him came his three sons, Carlos, Eduardo, and Flavio, which will also reproduce what the father says, although in a bit more, because Bolsonaro is a military and he actually has this rude way. His sons usually say the same things, but in a bit more elegant way. And then after that, it started to come together all the other congressmen and people that start to support his idea. Almost all of them, they were not politicians by career. Many of them are ex-policemen, people that lost their their beloved ones in the drug war, people that they felt in their skin the problems created by the degeneration of the country. But on the head of all that, and I would say even as important as Bolsonaro, there was few writers that with their books and with their articles in the internet, because newspapers in Brazil, they don't give space for conservative thinking. But in the internet, in YouTube, Facebook, and especially by their books, because at least there is one or two book publishers in Brazil that are conservative, they start to influence the population. And the main name in this new Brazilian conservative revival is a man called Olavo de Carvalho, which was, he left Brazil in the 90s when the socialists dominated, they took over the universities. He was basically kicked out from his university, and he was invited by few countries. One of them was United States, so he went to live there to have his living. But he never stopped to criticize all those things that happened. And in the last 2 years, his books are among the most read, the most sold of the country. He's always in the top 10 of the most selling books.
And can you name any of his main book or most important book, perhaps? If it has an English title?
Yeah, actually, he have a few publications in English, not much, although some of them are in the way of translation. But his most famous English publication is a book called, I just checked here, yes. It's the new era. No, it's a book made by him and Alexander Dugin from Russia, and it's more like a debate between him and just 1 second. I'll check here the name because I have the name in Portuguese. The New Order. It's a book between him and Alexander Dugin called The New Order, the word New Order, or just The New Order, where he and Dugin, they put their views of the whole neo-marxist revival that appeared in France, the globalist concepts, and of course they have the same critics, both Olavo de Carvalho and Dugin, they criticize the same things, but they diverge drastically in how to touch those points or how to react to the globalist threat. So they diverge in this point, but they made very similar critics to it. So this is his most famous book and also one of the first.
And could you say anything about his main points against the globalists?
Yeah, because while Dugin put together the intellectual foundation of a conservative traditionalist society together with a military and somehow even a expansionist view, Olavo de Carvalho, he goes that, even using the example of Brazil, that during some time we had a military hegemony of conservatives because the military regime was conservative, but they still never cared about the intellectual establishments. They had the military hegemony, they were crushing the Marxist guerrillas in Brazil, but they simply allowed the universities and the media to be taken over.
Yep.
So the critics of Olavo de Carvalho is the military is secondary at this point. It's secondary because it doesn't matter that we crush the Marxist guerrillas. It doesn't matter that we crush the neo-Marxists in a military way if they are teaching our kids to be the new Marxist guerrillas tomorrow, and then we will need to crush our own kids. So the first thing that we should do is a cultural war and a cultural takeover, a cultural reaction or a counter-revolution. That's his exactly words. The priority is in the cultural counter-revolution. So we should have media, we should have society together with us, but the universities and schools should be our first target.
Is he linked intellectually somehow to this group, Tradition, Family, Property?
Actually, he is not linked to them. Although, and this is another very interesting thing, he never mentioned this group because he had some minor quarrels in very small subjects with one of the heads of the Tradition, Family, and Property. So they just never mention each other. But their ideas are so similar that at some point, even the followers of both trends, they say, I think that someone is plagiarizing someone here because they have very similar outlooks of the world. There is a writer that he said in a very simple way. While Tradition, Family, and Property, which was founded by Plínio, another Brazilian writer, and is spread all over the world, while they write their things and they act among elites, among very well-educated people, and Olavo de Carvalho, he writes in a way that is, he even put some slangs and bad words in his writing, but he writes in a way that his books easily figure among the most sold. It's not easy for everyone to read a book from Pliny, which was the founder of Tradition, Family, and Property. But
Pliny de Oliveira.
Not in your face,
so,
very easy.
So it's like more or less, I mean, is it fiction or is it political theory, even if it's done in a popular way?
It's political theory. And he had another book called The Collective Imbecile, which is also political theory. And there is one book of him that it's together actually with a French philosopher called René Guénon. René Guénon. Although Olavo de Carvalho was a student of René Guénon, and he absorbed a lot of the teachings of René Guénon, but nowadays, 50% of the things that he wrote in this book with René Guénon, he actually dismissed them, and he says, it was, I was very young, and during this phase of my life, I was motivated by foolish things. So he changed his outlook a bit.
Yep. All right, interesting. And that's the main intellectual influence?
Yes. Olavo de Carvalho, he is the main intellectual influence. But during the last 8 years or 9 years, he had a private course called Philosophy Course of Olavo de Carvalho. In Portuguese, it's called COF, where he, by a limited number of people that is scribed, nowadays there is even a waiting list, but he started to teach his ideas to few people, and a lot of them became famous writers, and some of them have key roles in the government of Bolsonaro. For example, the Ministry of Foreign Relations was ex-student of Olavo de Carvalho. The Minister of Education was ex-student of Olavo de Carvalho. One of the speaker of the presidency, the advisor of foreign relations, and many key roles in the government of Bolsonaro are occupied by people that were students in this private course, in this very disputed course of Olavo de Carvalho. He denies, he doesn't like to be called the guru of the government. Somehow he put his ideas in a lot of people that is inside the government. And some of them, including, they actually created some quarrels already in the government, mostly because they adopt a very disruptive way. So in Brazil, pretty much like in other presidential countries, differently than parliamentary countries where you have a prime minister, the president, he have quite big powers. He's not subjected to untrust vote from the parliament. And the main opposition from the president came from the Congress and the Senate. So those people of Olavo de Carvalho that are inside the government, they say the Congress, they are the old politics. A lot of congressmen, they are still from the Social Democrats. A lot of congressmen, they are from the socialists, yet they were not voted out of power. So we should not do agreements with them. We should not do deals with them, because any deal that is done with the Workers' Party or with the Social Democrats are deals made with the devil, with people that want us dead. Mm-hmm. What we do is we put our projects on the table, and when they don't agree it, we just call the people to our side. So a few weeks ago, they made that, and again, thousands of people went to the street for the approval of a package that is for harsher laws against criminals. Mm. Probably they will soon do that again, which for the media, and of course the media still supports Social Democrats and socialists, they tell that he is creating instability in the country, but they're just playing by their book.
But can you please explain to me how this works? So they have some kind of a policy initiative. And
yeah.
Instead of calling some of the members of parliament, they are addressing their supporters to take to the streets, and in that way they hope to force the parliament to acknowledge these policies.
Exactly that. During the times of Social Democrats and socialists, the government were approving their projects by either giving roles in those state companies to the parties that they wanted to have votes, or either just giving money, plain money, like the socialists were doing. 300 billion they give to congressmen to approve their projects. And Bolsonaro, already during his campaign, he always said, one of my politics is going to be no alliance with Social Democrats and no alliance with socialists. With criminals, we don't negotiate. Mm. We fight them. And right now that he's in the government, those congressmen, they're being a harsher opposition than was expected. So to keep on his track, and Bolsonaro 1 week ago, he already said, I prefer to not approve any project than risk negotiating with people that I want to see then in jail. Mm-hmm. So he's not negotiating with those people. There is a very important reform to be approved that can put because in Brazil, people retired at 58 years old. That's extremely young retirement. Mm. And that is very unsustainable. So he needs to approve a reform to increase that to the normal level of 62 years. And he needs votes in the Congress. And one reporter asked him, what you're going to do? Because you need votes from the parties that are your opposition. And he said, I prefer to fall my government and to be impeached and to be kicked out than to betray the people that voted me. I will not negotiate with them. And parallel to that, because Olavo de Carvalho nowadays, he have around 3 to 4 million people of reach in his social networks. So when he talks something, he can easily put hundreds of thousands of people in the street, or he can easily say to hundreds of thousands of people to pressure a parliamentary. So he already managed even to fire people that some congressmen hired to some secretaries that they have this independence. And by popular support, he managed to fire these people. And apparently that is how it's going to be the ways that things are going now, particularly because this total opposition of ways to behave between Bolsonaro, between Olavo de Carvalho, and the whole social democrat and socialist parties. And the militaries that were always a base of support of Bolsonaro, they stand more or less in the middle of that. Because although they don't want socialists in power, they also don't want people on the streets protesting against things.
Does the military still have any constitutional powers?
Right now, no. Right now, no. They don't have any constitutional powers. Although in the government of Bolsonaro, of the 14 ministries, 7 are actually militaries.
And our Bolsonaro, President Bolsonaro, the chief of the army also, executive?
Yeah, the chief of the army, because in a presidential country, those two functions are together, the head of state, the head of the army. So, and the head of the government. All of them are concentrated in the president. So he had this idea that the militaries, they don't want people on the streets. So they somehow are a bit shaken by this modus operandi of put the people against the congressmen that don't want to follow the agenda of Bolsonaro. And there is a small loophole, a small problem in this way of behaving of Bolsonaro are the northern states. Because the northern states of Brazil, although they are only 30% of the population, they are states that are heavily socialist. And when you have people on the streets asking, please stop increasing taxes for people to retire very early or for social benefits for the northern states. And then at the northern states, you had people going to the streets and say, don't cut our benefits. So yes, we can say that the next years for the government of Bolsonaro for sure are not gonna be easy in this point. They are not gonna be easy. But the most important thing, and this is something that he's already doing, and we can say that he's doing quite successfully, is to reduce the hegemony of the socialists in the universities and the media. The first piece of paper that he signed in the presidency was a bill prohibiting any state company to sponsor TV channels over a certain very small value budget. So while the socialists, they were spending in the media, basically they were giving money to the socialist media to fund their operations. 71 billion in 3 years, the government of Bolsonaro this year will give only 150 million. So what the socialists were spending in 4 days is what Bolsonaro is going to spend in the media during a whole year. To the point that some channels and some magazines and some newspapers are already they're already filing for bankruptcy because they cannot survive without government money. And now those leftist journalists that were educated in France, that at the beginning of our talk, I say that they bring those ideas of Foucault, all of them are going to the streets. All of them are being laid off. And that is probably, until now, that is the most successful thing that Bolsonaro is doing to reduce the hegemony of the left in the universities and at the media.
And I didn't understand what has he done at the universities. So regarding media, he has forbidden the state-owned companies to buy significant volumes of ads. Exactly,
because before it was up to the state companies to decide how much they wanted to invest.
Yep.
And since the Workers' Party infiltrated their members at pretty much every state company by thousands, they were just funding the media, and in exchange, the media would the six main TV channels of Brazil, except the TV channel of evangelicals, they would serve as propaganda machines for the socialists. And the first step that Bolsonaro done, he entered in war against the media, and he made a bill saying that the state companies should not go beyond the budget of 150 million per year, which is pretty much nothing. 150 million in a country like Brazil for so many TV channels, it's nothing. So they are already having their problems and laying off all those journalists. One of those channels...
excuse me, what currency are you talking about?
I'm talking about Brazilian real. To put that into euros, you would imagine 40 million euros.
Yep.
40 million euros, which is pretty much nothing. And meanwhile, this evangelical TV channel, and they, in their evangelical way, in their almost like a neoconservative Protestant American way, they are a bit more friendly to Bolsonaro. So another thing that Bolsonaro started to do is he will not talk to any of those 5 channels. He will only give interviews to this evangelical channel, and his main tool of communication is going to be Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. He completely refuses to talk.
And he still does that?
What?
He still refuses to talk to them? I mean, outside of press conferences?
No, in press conferences, he talks to them. But in those private interviews or those very new things, because it was a tradition, there is a big channel in Brazil called TV Globo, it was a tradition that all the presidential announcements, let's say a new bill, a new law, or a new indication for the ministry was first announced on this channel, Globo. Bolsonaro, he just put that he will not announce anything anymore in TV. The things that he wants to announce, he will announce on Twitter or in his YouTube channel by his words. And then any other channel, they are always putting things after he announced on his Twitter and YouTube. He even found one informant that was leaking information. He was fired, and he said on YouTube, I am firing him because he was informing this TV channel Globo, and he's an enemy of the nation because he's informing enemies of the nation. Well, this idea that he's using, which is also something that Olavo de Carvalho, he was always saying that the first measure of the president is to mine the confidence of people in the socialist media.
Yep.
And he's doing that very well. He's mining the confidence that the population have on the media.
So you would say he is fully aware of this neo-Marxist influence in the media, and that he is oriented towards counter-revolution some way?
Yes, I would say that he's fully aware in the point that this was all... he's fully listening to what Olavo de Carvalho says to him. And this is one of the things that Olavo de Carvalho pointed very strongly. The neo-Marxist influence in the universities and the media should be the first target.
Yep. The
broken of their hegemony should be the first thing to be achieved. All the other things, economy, infrastructure, all the other things are secondary to that. Because the government is not going to survive if we don't break their hegemony. So being aware of that, he is managing very well to break at least their financing sources and their informational sources. Because nowadays there is no reason for someone to watch a newspaper expecting that they will see for the first time information of the government, because the president announced his things on Twitter.
So you wouldn't be worried about him being on the populist side in a European meaning?
No, I would not. I would not worry for sure. I would not worry for sure, especially given the fact that in European standards, I would say that Bolsonaro today is very close to what Salvini is in Italy. Because both have very similar problems. Although I would say that, of course, the problems that Italy have are minor compared to the problems that Brazil had. But both have very similar problems, and both came somehow a bit isolated in ways. So they must adopt a populist strategy because they don't have the party structure that the others have. There is one thing that is very shocking about how Bolsonaro came to power. He spent on his campaign 2% of the amount of money that the Social Democrats spent and 3% of the amount of money that the socialists spent. He had on television 8 seconds, while the Social Democrats had 16 minutes and the socialists had 11 minutes. He barely could say his name. But everyone started to know him because the media started to tell, hey, this guy is telling that he would prefer to beat his kid instead of his kid being gay. So the media actually made the whole propaganda of him even against their own will. So he must be a populist. He must say shocking things. Why? Because he doesn't have money and neither huge party structure to serve him.
And what was his initiative at the university to target neo-marxists there?
Yes, in the universities, because the universities, they actually don't finance, they form the new neo-marxists. And one of his things is that we reduce somehow the independent way that the universities choose their the main coordinator of the university, the dean.
Yep.
So right now the universities are fully free to choose their deans, and he's starting to put some requirements, and among them, those requirements, is one that expects the deans to also come from careers of STEM fields, which is science, engineering, medical studies.
Yep.
When you have universities being coordinated during such a long time by philosophers, sociologists, historians, geographers, of course you have a much heavier Marxist influence.
Definitely.
So when he brings people from STEM fields, even although of course there are socialists that are studying medicine or engineering, but the number is much more reduced, much smaller. And this is one of his first measures. The second one is to, and this is actually quite recent, is to start, and although it's a bit funny, it may sound funny, but is to put exams to detect drugs in the blood of people that are going to be paid by university. And just by doing that, probably he will eliminate a lot of the social.
Rather creative.
Yeah.
All right, we will have to start to wrap up, but could you say something and ending? What would be the most important takeaway from a European perspective on Bolsonaro?
I would say that the most important takeaway from that is that the political victories, they should not be the main target of anti-socialist, anti-liberal, anti-neo-Marxist fight. The political victories, they are just the cherry in the cake. Bolsonaro came to power not because he had a big political victory, but it was something that started years and years before with writers, with thinkers that went in the counter currency of the intelligentsia in the universities and in the media. Because when you start to fight against the media and the universities, you start to put people at your side. And after that, it should come the political victories. So to have a real counter revolutionary, a real conservative, a real populist, I would say, victory, the first thing to be achieved is the intellectual and the structural victory. Because without that, when you put into power a populist politician, but at the same time, you allow universities, you allow the media. I'm not talking about closing universities or closing the media, but just offering to the people the other view. Because the media and the universities will tell things that, of course, are biased against him. But you should have an alternative for that. And after that, it comes the political victory. And for that, even money is not going to be that important. Because, as I said, he had a very poor campaign. Money is not that important. What is important is to put people at our side. And the first step to that is to have courage enough to say things that the population want to listen because they're tired. Even if those things that are going to say may put you in jail, like he almost went because he was talking about the gay lobby. Even if those things are going to put you into jail, if you're not going to jail, probably you are going to be president anyway.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And also I think he's a little bit inspirational in the way you discuss it here also, that the political victory is only one step to continue the fight. I mean, at least here in Europe, it's easy to have the perspective that if we only come to power, everything will be solved. But the political power should be used exactly as Bolsonaro are doing to target the media and the universities and continue or increasing cultural shift in the whole country.
Exactly that.
Yeah, this has been very interesting. I'm very glad that you could join us and talk a little bit about Brazil. And we really hope that Bolsonaro will do an excellent job.
Thank you. We hope that too, and we also hope that Europe will keep going the great way that it's starting to do it. We know that it is still the beginning, but we hope that all that is happening right now keeps happening and keeps going the good way.
Yeah, there are some small lights on a very dark sky at the moment. All right. Thank you again, and thank you to our listeners, and we will be back in a couple of weeks.